Well, we can start with this one, the terrifying graph. Employment to population ratio in the United States, more or less since World War II. The two biggest things to notice on the graph are A, feminism. The rise in the employment to population ratio from 1970 into the 1990s as women enter the workforce and are no longer in the position that Sandra Day O'Connor was, say, when she graduated first in her class from Stanford Law School, of getting no private sector job offers at all. And the second biggest feature in the graph is the red arrow at the far right, which is the collapse in the employment to population ratio that is currently going on in the American economy. And because of that collapse, last March I got a note from Ward Hanson asking me to come down here and talk about, quote, the impact of the stimulus bill on jobs creation, the contrast between the Romer-Bernstein estimates of the benefits of the stimulus plan versus Kogan-Taylor et al. That estimate arguably very little benefit. So I said yes, and I reread Romer and Bernstein, and I read Kogan, Quick, Taylor, and Wieland, and I ran into somewhat of a problem, I thought. That is, Kogan et al. Write that this figure 1 I've put up on the board shows how Romer and Bernstein think government spending affects the economy, and also shows exactly the same policy change in another study by one of us, John Taylor. The results are vastly different. The Romer-Bernstein estimates apparently fail a simple robustness test, being far different from existing published results of another model. And this surprised me, right? Because I talked to Christy Romer, who's now C.C. Rouse's boss as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. I talked to Jared Bernstein, who is now in an unusual position as not one of the president's 3 chief economic advisors, but as the vice president's chief economic advisor, which I think probably makes him about the same as Sisi. That is, the deputy advisor to the president is probably the same as the advisor to the vice president. And I knew that their intention had been to pull standard models off the shelf and use them and not get involved in any dispute over what model to use or in whether they had their thumb on the scales. So I dug. And I found that Kogan et al.'s claim of exactly the same policy change, well, it seemed to me to simply be wrong. That the Romer-Bernstein model, that's an increase in government spending with the Federal Reserve expanding and keeping on expanding the money supply in order to keep the short-term Treasury bill interest rate pegged at 0 as the government fiscal expansion continues. While John Taylor, back in 1903, had modeled an increase in government spending with the Federal Reserve then contracting the real money supply in response to push the short-term Treasury bill interest rate up over time in order to keep inflation from creeping up and in order to keep unemployment from falling in the long run. The results are different because the policy changes are different. Right? One policy is government spending while you expand the money stock. The other policy is government spending while you contract the money stock. So given that Kogan et al. Is not what it's being sold as, a critique of the argument of Romer-Bernstein, what should I do? It would be rude to stop right now. So let me lay out why at this moment someone like Christy Romer, who is fundamentally a monetarist, a believer in monetary policy, who has written in the past about how fiscal policy doesn't really have a place in dealing with the business cycle, who has a big paper I just assigned to the graduate students about how it was monetary policy and monetary expansion that made what difference was made in the late 1930s, and not fiscal policy in fighting the Great Depression. Why is she a believer in, a designer of, an advocate for this American Reinvestment and Recovery Act? And the analysis I'm going to give, it's in the pattern of that given by one of Milton Friedman's teachers, Jacob Viner, back when he called for large and continuous budget deficits to combat the mass unemployment of the times being the 1930s, being the Great Depression. And I'm going to give it because this is Milton Friedman's place, or one of his places here, and that Friedman applauded Viner's analysis and saw it as superior to the analyses of others like John Maynard Keynes, so far as policy is concerned. For Friedman wrote in the early 1970s, Keynes had nothing to offer those of us who had sat at the feet of economists like Henry Simons, Lloyd Mintz, Frank Knight, and Jacob Viner. So start with the quantity theory of money, with the idea that the total flow of spending in the economy, prices times quantities, prices times output, is equal to the stock of money in the economy M, bank reserves, cash, checking account balances, other liquid assets that people think they can rapidly spend, the quantity of money times the velocity of money V. If PY threatens to fall, threatening a fall in production and sales, and a rise in unemployment, then the standard policy Milton Friedman, Jacob Viner, and indeed Christy Romer would recommend would be to boost M. And provided that velocity V does not move in the opposite direction to offset the increase in M, spending will stabilize, and deflation and depression and high unemployment will be averted. And of course, there's a loose end. The loose end is V, is how fast households and businesses spend their cash balances. Studies in the quantity theory of money in the 1950s established fairly well that a key determinant of velocity is the nominal interest rate. Holding purchasing power in the form of cash rather than in, say, bonds is expensive when interest rates are high. You would either rather spend your cash quickly and buy something, or move your cash back into bonds that pay the interest rate, rather than just sitting there paying next to nothing, either in your pocket or in your checking account. The velocity of money, by contrast, tends to be low when interest rates are low, because delaying purchases while you comparison shop is not very costly. You lose very little in foregone interest that you could have been earning because the interest rate is low. And this dependence of the velocity of money on the interest rate, this puts a limit on the effectiveness of monetary policy, which is our principal recession-fighting tool. When you expand the money stock, you increase the ratio of money to bonds. By simple supply and demand, that raises the price of bonds in terms of money. And when the price of bonds goes up, the interest rate goes down. So when you raise the interest rate, you lower velocity. Now, this matters when interest rates on assets like Treasury bills get very low, like zero, like they are now. If you are holding your money right now in a 6-month Treasury bill, you get, well, the latest number I have is 0.28% per year as of Monday afternoon in interest, 28 cents on every $100. And you run a small risk that interest rates might rise over the next month, and your bill might lose a little value. If you hold your money in cash, it's safe, at least in nominal terms. Thus, there's no economic incentive pushing V up, pushing anyone to spend their cash when interest rates are very low. And there's no economic reason for the velocity of money to be pinned at any particular value. Thus, when the central bank tries to boost nominal spending through standard monetary expansion, it might prove ineffective, that interest rates will drop even closer to zero as the ratio of money to bonds rises, and the velocity of money might well drop to offset the boost to the money stock. There have been a lot of mights in the past paragraph or two, and now let me change them to R's. Where do you think we are right now? Where we are right now is at the bottom of the thick black line at the edge of that graph up there, the graph of the velocity of circulation for the measure of the money supply, M2, right now. And we're there because the Federal Reserve is boosting the money supply with extraordinary force, has doubled the monetary base over the past 7 months, and the velocity of money appears to be dropping like a stone, offsetting all, and in fact more than all, of the boost to the money supply that's currently going on. So in order to ensure that monetary expansion is effective, you need to do something to pin the velocity of money to some value, to give economic incentives to have people to spend their money. You need to do something to boost interest rates.